programmatic advertising, fear, and vast. That's what we're talking about this week on Sounds Profitable with me, Bryan Barletta. I know that you're listening to Sounds Profitable because podcast ad tech is important to you, but it's important to me that you are kept up to date on the latest news from the entire podcast industry. To help with that, here's what happened last week, no matter when you're listening, from James Cridland at Podnews. When people hear programmatic advertising, most people immediately think open marketplace. That's just not the case, and I've discussed this further in my article titled Programmatic Advertising, the Hero Podcast Publishers Need. But why is this misunderstanding happening? To figure it out, I spoke with Ben Masse from Triton Digital. Here's what he had to say. Well, thanks, Ben, for joining me today. So I wanted to ask you a few questions. The article that we're going over is my one on programmatic advertising. And I think one of the big things that I covered in that article was there was a lot of confusion with programmatic. So I kind of wanted to dive in first there and ask your thoughts on why do people default to thinking that all programmatic is open marketplace?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe because it started as an open marketplace when display programmatic started with display on browsers, I don't even know when, maybe 15, 20 years ago. And then it moved to video. But I remember that when at Triton, we started thinking about programmatic audio. So I started at Triton in 2012. And so that was one of the first projects I tackled, how to help publisher get better monetization. So this is when we've approached trading desks and DSPs and SSPs at the time to talk about audio. And I remember attending some trade shows in New York City where they started to talk about upper funnel programmatic rather than just direct response. And then buyers wanting to pick and choose publishers. So that was even before header bidding and all of that. So I think the concept of having private marketplace or deals is maybe 8-9 years old versus programmatic in general, which must be 15 to 20 years old. And also there's a lot of people doing comparison between the stock exchange and programmatic advertising. And usually when you trade on a NASDAQ or any other stock exchange, it's a public market. So I think by default, people think it's always a public space rather than a private space. And then it could also be just laziness. People will just bundle everything into an open marketplace, either because they want to make a point saying I don't want to do programmatic. It's just an open marketplace with the race to the bottom price, and you don't know who's advertising on you or publishers making their inventory available. So I think there's good and bad reason why we keep thinking, for some actually, that programmatic is an open marketplace.
Gotcha. Yeah, that explains a lot of it. I mean, I guess with that in mind there, when we think about open marketplace, the mindset there is that I list my inventory and it's not identified to the person buying it until after it's purchased, right? It meets the targeting criteria that they're looking for. It meets the price and everything. And then standard open marketplace means that they don't explain that it's Bryan's website or Bryan's podcast until after the purchase of that impression has happened, right?
No, actually, it depends of the settings and the DSPs. So it is an audience buy. So you're 100% accurate on that. So people buying on the open exchange or marketplace will usually not trade on that exchange to target a specific publisher. However, with everything related to fighting fraud and brand safety. So for the past, I don't remember when the chief marketing officer of Procter & Gamble had his famous speech at the IB Leadership Summit. I think that's 4 or 5 years ago, where he said that he wanted to make sure that only vetted publishers with MRC accreditation or equivalent would be considered. So from that point on, I think that the idea behind all the SPs is to know exactly what's cooking. So when you follow the OpenRTB protocol, and especially when you implement the ads.text and equivalents, you are disclosing the properties and who's behind the properties and who's representing those properties. So when you use like standard DSPs like Google, the Trade Desk, MediaMath, you will see via the bid landscape all of the information. So you wouldn't know it's Bryan's website that you would be bidding on. But the reality is traders won't be selecting Bryan's website. They will be selecting a podcast. They would say, I want to just target B2B podcasts, which is your podcast. Your target.
I'd say so, yeah.
Enterprise, not consumers. And if they want to be more precise, they could say like a podcast on mostly consume on a certain type of device. Let's say they just want to target people on iOS because it's a telco that wants to promote a new phone or something like that. So they will put those criteria. So they won't be necessarily selecting websites. They could have allow and block lists. So that's something you can do in the open exchange. So you would say, I'm buying anything except that type of websites or publishers, either by category or by being specific on brands. So it's in most transactions on the open exchange, open marketplace is fully transparent, not just at the impression. Some networks will obfuscate the information. So you will only get it when you, as you stated, when you get the report. So I suppose it's up to the publisher and the buyer to decide, do they want to work with semi-opaque or fully opaque networks versus fully transparent? There are pluses and minuses on both. The pluses on opaqueness, you should be working with opaque or semi-opaque network because you have, from a publisher perspective, a minimum guarantee because you're bundled into a portfolio of publishers represented by that network. And as a buyer, it's convenience because you will work with a network that you trust. So, they represent publishers that you trust, and they will pick and choose the right property to fulfill the buy according to the brief. So that would be like one of the key advantage there.
What you're talking about is less that the buyers are going to have control or the tools to say, I want to target specifically Bryan's podcast, but more that my podcast will be associated with a network that is trusted and verified, or my content is trusted and verified with whatever technology partner I connect with. And therefore it has clout, right? Like
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
And so you mentioned ads.txt and you mentioned MRC. And so for the people who are podcast first, MRC is another 3-letter word, which is a terrible thing in this space. And it's one more certification. And, I don't think it's really gotten like high adoption yet in podcasts. It seems to be getting adoption in audio in general, right?
Yeah. So the MRC participated to the IAB V2 podcast measurement guidelines. So they were one of the member contributing to the original guidelines. But you're right that so Triton is also working with the MRC, but we're working with the MRC for the live streaming measurement, not for the podcast. Podcast is the IAB. And one of the reasons why the MRC has maybe not stepped in the podcast space, which MRC, by the way, stands for Media Rating Council. So it's because the IAB is there already with a standard, for which the MRC has contributed to. And then it's a limited scope of what you can do in podcasts because Apple Podcasts or Spotify podcast app are not sending client-side signal to the hosting company.
Yeah.
So we need to work with a different methodology than the one that the MRC is usually advocating, which is either a player-side or client-side signal or a validated server-side signal. Validated by meaning for a fact that someone actually listened to the stream, which is possible to do when you stream, but not necessarily when you download. So sorry to have
no, it's
like
great.
Going into a rabbit hole here, but that's
I think that one thing that I want to just harp on there is that I think we keep saying that podcasting is limited, and I think that it's true that compared to other mediums it is, but like this is an industry where people are like working really hard to make money, right? Margins are great. Advertising is one of the bigger industries that grew during a pandemic, especially podcast advertising, it seems, right? And so like, it's so funny to me that like MRC as an organization if they are so focused on this player side stuff, I wish that they would get out there and go talk to the podcast players and push that, because it would help all of us and legitimize the things that they're asking for that there's more of. So that's why I don't always like, and that's why, I got to stand on my soapbox here and say that, like, I don't think it's limited on our end. It's limited on their scope of who they're willing to get to buy into their certification in podcasting, and also on the fact that they're just looking at limited data points. I mean, we saw the entire world focus on mobile ad IDs and cookies. And now with the change in iOS 14 and Apple and Firefox and soon Chrome's change with third-party cookies, like, the entire industry didn't just collapse. They were just like, well, I guess we got to look at IP and identity. And so I think, my challenge to groups like the MRC is, like, adapt to podcasting. Don't just keep telling us to adapt,
Yes, I agree that the challenges or the limitations are not, I would say, absolute limitations. There are more limitation due to the current state of technology or business or expectations. Establishing standards, though, requires industry lobby. You don't want, a bit like what is happening where Apple has established new rules for the mobile ad ID, or Google pushing for Turtle Dove, which is their own stance at how they should manage the end of cookies and the third-party cookies and the browsers and so on and so forth. So you'd rather have industry lobby coming with someone which is a standard accepted by more than a single individual, to just make sure everyone has a voice on the chapter. But every time you want to do that, it takes more time. So basically, standards will always be behind the reality.
Yeah.
However, what needs to happen is that whomever is acting in that industry has to keep an open mind. So advertisers, marketers. So on the advertisers side, the marketers, the agencies, the DSPs, and all of the other ad tech vendors on the buy side as well as on the sell side, to make sure that, okay, there are standards in place and limitations. And instead of ignoring everything that does not fit into the box, we would be okay to have some wiggle room to just make sure that the transactions can happen and people can adapt how things are being done, which is what is happening in podcasts. We've seen a surge of programmatic podcasts in the past 30 days. I think a few years back, or maybe a year back, it was probably less than 5% maybe of the transactions. We've seen in the past 60 days that we're at 15% of all of the transactions in the exchange going to podcasts, which is a huge growth.
That is huge.
Triple growth. And knowing that the exchange, the marketplace, has crossed the 1 billion mark in terms of transactions, it's growing, because it was maybe half that size a year ago. So, like, relatively speaking, the podcast space is growing really fast in programmatic. But again, it depends of the publisher, the strategy, because programmatic could be first strategy for some publishers, and for others, it's more like a fallback. So it depends where they put programmatic in their mind and in their ad tech stack.
So before we get into that part, because I do want to dig into it, with ads.text, right? That's an identifier of my site. It's a framework that says this is who the site is. I put this information there, and it's available in other formats, or I guess.
Yeah, it's read. Yeah, correct. And it's read by the DSP. So every time you submit a request, you need to put the domain name of your publisher, which is a problem in podcasts for a smaller podcast, but for a bigger podcast group, they always have a website. And the DSP need to check that website to make sure, like, who has the right to represent. So let's say a publisher is using Triton. Triton has to be listed there. So when the DSP gets requests for that specific podcast, and in the ads.text it's declared, then they know it's not fraudulent, because what they wanted to do is to avoid someone claiming that they represent Bryan's podcast when they're not. And then let's say they make money, they want to make sure actually Bryan's is making money, and not someone that spoofed the address and is just like claiming,
that's smart,
claiming that they own the podcast.
But so is it accurate to say that a lot of programmatic advertising in podcasting is based off of the VAST protocol instead of the open RTB protocol?
It depends of the hosts. So that's a good question. I cannot claim that I know how every other podcast host is working, but Triton, we are connected to all the SPs via OpenRTB, which is the standard protocol for connecting domain-side platform or DSPs to sell-side platform SSP. So Triton as an SSP. And then the publisher hosts will call the SSP. So between the ad server or the hosts, like Omni Studio in the case of Triton, and the SSP, it's usually a VAST tag because you will delegate your...
So Omni to Triton is VAST, but Triton to the other partners out there is RTB, OpenRTB.
Yes, but what I've seen though is some hosting platform and or publisher will accept a VAST tag coming directly from a DSP, which is so from the buyer tool. The big negative on this is that you don't know what's in the VAST tag because the VAST tag is not built to filter what's going on. Basically, if you accept a VAST tag from a DSP, you need to trust whomever gave you that VAST tag.
Yeah, it's an open
DSP
portal.
Because you don't have price, you don't have floor, you don't have industry separation, you don't have allow and block lists. Whereas when you use an SSP, this is what you get from the SSP. It would say like, I'm okay, but only on those conditions, which could be like we talked about it, open exchange versus private deals, like brands that are authorized or categories authorized, minimum price. You could have like variations, like in the US, I'm okay with this, but in the UK,
exactly, yeah,
and all of this. So this is all of those rules are on the SSP. So as a publisher, I would not want to put tags without having someone fixing and filtering the content of those tags.
Yeah.
So I would use an SSP. I don't think it's a good idea to put a VAST tag, but it works. But I don't think it's best practice.
No, I agree with you. And I think that, so for everybody listening, I always confuse SSP and DSP and think of SSP. It's supply side platform, but I like sell side platform because it helps remind me who's selling their inventory. The amount of times I get on a call and I have to like Google it beforehand. I'm like, I don't want to say the wrong one, but that, Ben's really right there because what an SSP is going to enable you to do is say, this is my inventory and this is how I want to represent it. Here are my conditions. Like Ben said, you can set like your IAB content category blocks. You can block specific domains. You can set specific rules based on targeting, such as geo. So like you said, I can say in the US, don't allow Pepsi to be an advertiser, but outside the US, I'll allow it so that I'm not worrying about, maybe a direct deal I had there. And I can also say, in the US, I sell at a $30 CPM. So there's no way that I want to allow anybody to buy cheaper than that in the US. But in, Southeast Asia, I'm selling at a $15 CPM and not getting a lot of fill. So I'm willing to negotiate down to $10. And so that's the SSP gives you all those options. The DSP, when you think about it, all a VAST tag is instead of putting an MP3 in to say this is the audio for the ad, it's saying instead of putting a static ad there, call another ad server, give someone else full decision and control. So the SSP represents you and the DSP represents the advertiser. And so, that's the exact reason to have an SSP in place because you configure who you are, what you want, and it interacts with the DSP to make sure it matches the advertiser. Using just a DSP's VAST tag gives them direct access to you and not a lot of controls or restrictions on your end.
Exactly. And then if you have two buyers using two DSPs or the same DSPs, you get like multiple VAST tag. And what do you do with those? Like which VAST tag do you want to prioritize versus the other? And it becomes complicated. That's why it's better to use an SSP that is built specifically to deal with programmatic demands.
Yeah. And so putting you on the spot with that, I got to ask. So an SSP doesn't exist for the altruistic nature of protecting publishers. What should someone expect the average cut to be that's taken out of the CPMs from an SSP?
So just a clarification point here. So the SSP is built not to be altruistic, but on behalf of supporting the publishers. So Triton do not have a DSP. So we do not sell anything to the advertiser. So because of that, our technology is built to be biased in favor of publishers.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's a big point for Triton that I want to make sure that everybody's clear of because I don't think it's super clear. Triton doesn't currently create any of their own inventory, and they currently do not sell or represent advertisers. So it is all publisher tools, which is really relevant to think about when we talk about both programmatic and your ranker, which I'm definitely going to cover in the future. But, I think you guys have so many cool tools, and it's kind of hard sometimes to understand all the differences between them. So that's something I want to make sure everybody's clear, that Triton is a company that represents the publisher and has ad tech. Whereas a lot of the other platforms out there both represent the publisher and the buyer or advertiser. And, that it's just a very different view, and it's really cool.
Yes. Thank you for all of that. So to answer your question, so the standard rates for the open exchange is usually 30%, and the standard rate for private deals or any other ad network deals is 10%, which is pretty common across the SSP space. So we don't have minimum commits or charge any other fee. So basically, if you have a deal with a buyer using a DSP and they want to give you $10 CPM, we take 10% of that. So what it means is if there's no transaction, it costs nothing. If there's a transaction, we take 10% of this. These rates could be negotiated based on commitments, meaning that we know there are more traffic coming our way, or we are the exclusive SSP of a specific publisher. So everything is negotiable based on quantities or commitments, but those are pretty standard rates.
That's awesome. And then you as an SSP are connected to all these other DSPs. Are there,
Yes.
If I as a publisher for whatever reason came across a DSP that you weren't integrated with, would you guys evaluate an integration or?
Yes, we do, because so basically any DSP that follows OpenRTB 2.3, but in 2.3, the audio concept didn't exist. So we need to pass audio via the video tag. And 2.4 plus is when the audio object is native inside the OpenRTB. We can connect to all of those. We're also connected to BitSwitch, which is an integrator connected to like hundreds and hundreds of DSPs. So basically we have about 30 DSPs already connected to our platform. The big one like Google, the Trade Desk, MediaMath, as well as the specialized one like AdsWiz, TargetSpot, but also independent trading desks like AdTheorent or AdForm or Dynamics. So we have like a lot of those. At the moment, we're actively integrating DSPs in South Asia and Southeast Asia. So we have a list of maybe 5 to 10 DSPs integrating. We have a team that is just doing that DSP
That's
integration
awesome.
because we don't want to block demand. The goal, and that's why the OpenRTB standard was put in place, is we have like a common way to shake hands between a DSP and an SSP.
Yeah. And so are DSPs out there that are compatible with streaming audio easily compatible with podcast audio, or are there changes that they have to make on their end?
So usually any DSP that supports video and CTV or outdoor should be quite easy to integrate. DSPs that are only trading on display sometimes is more challenging. The biggest challenge is the timeout, because we need to have time between requesting an ad and confirming that the ad was actually won and inserted, not won, but inserted. So the timeout will be where display-only DSPs are expecting instantaneous confirmation, which is not the case. We have some platform hosts that will take 2 hours before they can confirm if an ad was actually inserted or not in a podcast. So because of that, we need to make sure the DSPs will not time out, meaning will not stop bothering if we haven't confirmed within a given time frame. So this is the biggest limitations, but I would say that most DSPs are actively trading video and CTV now. So it's pretty rare that we have a DSP that will not be able to accommodate for those things.
That's really cool. So, I mean, at the end of the day, programmatic is allowing people to sell additional inventory, whether as a primary strategy or as a backup strategy. And it's also allowing people to connect in different ways with tools that are preferential to them. You know, direct sold might be something that people use a Google Doc to track everything and have to do it manually and host it all themselves. Whereas programmatic, even if it's a programmatic direct deal between two different companies, it's just a way to provide everything in one digestible format with using a piece of technology instead of spreadsheets that you have to copy and paste tracking pixels and creatives in. And so Ben, this was really great to have you here. I guarantee I'm going to have you back. There's a lot more to talk about related to Triton and your expertise in programmatic audio. But I guess I'm going to put you on the spot with my favorite question to ask all my guests. What is a podcast that you're listening to right now that you'd like to share with everybody?
So I do listen to a lot of podcasts on different topics, from current affairs to history. I would say one podcast that I quite like, because we have a lot of activities in Asia and I want to make sure I fully understand the trends, is Tech Buzz China, which is a podcast which is published, I think, every 2 weeks. And then they have some special podcasts that they release sometimes. So it's a professional podcast, which is part of the Pan Daily Network, I believe the name of the network. So they have really well produced, like 20 to 30 minute podcast that gives a good glimpse of what is cooking in China and sometimes spilling a bit outside of China. But it's really important because in the podcast space is really strong in the US and in the Anglo-Saxon world. But I would say, honestly, the Latin America and Spain, like Hispanic world, is also like blooming really well in podcasts. But China is probably actually the biggest podcast market. It's not the biggest for Triton nor most of the US companies, but it's like the population size is huge and they're quite advanced in consuming short snippets of audio, whether it's education, books, or others. So that's why I feel that podcast is really great to understand what's going on there.
Yeah, no, I super agree with you. I'm going to check that one out. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Bryan, for having me.
And stick around for some special bonus content at the end of the episode. I've teamed up with Terra to give you a minute-long strategic thought that is guaranteed to shift your perspective on the present and future of podcasting as we all work to make podcasting better. Thanks to Ben Masse for coming on to help expand on my article, Programmatic Advertising, the hero podcast publishers need. If you liked what you heard and want to connect, you can find me, Bryan Barletta, on LinkedIn, way less formally on Twitter as High5RPG, and of course you can email me, Bryan@soundsprofitable.com. The Sounds Profitable podcast and all cool ad tech bells and whistles you've experienced were thanks to our host and sponsor, Whooshkaa. Everything you've heard since the conversation ended was uniquely created to target you using their dynamic ad insertion features. If any of the callouts were wrong, let us know. Depending on how you're listening, there were over 10 opportunities to hear dynamically inserted content and ads in this episode. While we continue to tweak and innovate our setup, some of the breaks may be more noticeable than others. Thank you for bearing with us, and please send over your feedback. The Sounds Profitable podcast would not be possible without the help and support of Terra, James Cridland, Ian Powell, and Sam Mars. Thank you all for your help and support.